these, particularly times of dramatic change in the environment around us, in the mission of many organizations. It's not just in business, but in government and the military as well. One of the things that we're continually being asked for is more leadership. Well, both more leaders and more leadership, and the various reasons for that, not the least of which being that people really do want a sense of assurance that someone knows where we're going and how and why we're getting there. But equally important, I think what we're also beginning to see is that in addition to more leadership, actually we're asking for more leader-like behavior, which is to say, not more leaders from the point of view of positions in an organization titled leader, because we don't need more overhead, but actually more behavior that resembles what leaders do. So the real question is, how do you bring that out? It's not simply something that you pay for. It's not something that you simply exhort by means of emotional speeches or great symbolic messages. You have to do it in ways that actually draw upon the leader that resides in many people, that perhaps resides there in a place and a time that's not associated with work, but in their own lives where they have been leaders before. So part of what I want to try and talk about today is how do you bring out the leader in an individual, and equally important, how do you use the experience that they've had of being leaders, not only to enable them to be more effective leaders, but probably more importantly, how to learn and grow as leaders. Because one of the challenges we're encountering over and over again is the fact that when the times change, we actually need a far greater array of skills and competencies and capabilities on the part of leaders, not just doubling down on the skills and the competencies that you developed over the course of your career, but being in a position to be able to acquire new ones and to practice them quickly and to be able to bring them up to speed so that you can exercise them with the same level of competence, the same level of confidence that you do things that you learned a long time ago and repeated over and over again. So first question is, how do we develop more leaders faster? And second question is, how do we help people who are already responsible and taken on the mantle of leadership to more effectively learn new things, new ways of behaving? Now, a few years back, I had the opportunity with a colleague of mine, Warren Bennis, who teaches at USC. Some of you may be familiar with him, and I won't say anything more about USC because I got tickled earlier about all the other allegiances that exist inside the FBI, so not just USC. But Warren and I had the opportunity to do some research which I found fascinating, which was trying to understand whether or not the era in which you grow up or mature really has an impact on the way you define what it means to be a leader. In particular, what was of greatest interest to us was that if you took two ends of the age spectrum, people who grew up in, say, in the 1980s and 1990s, and compared them with people who grew up in the 1940s and 50s, were 15 to 25 years old during that time period, not only would they have experienced very different historical moments, but also different institutions, different political ideologies, different geographical and global context, different music, different themes of various sorts, all of which ultimately have an impact on the way people think about, well, what does it mean to be a leader? Why should I bother to lead? And under what conditions do I actually learn and grow as a leader? Well, I'll talk in a moment about some of the differences, the similarities, though, however, that were of greatest interest to us between leaders over the age of 75 who were still active as leaders and leaders under the age of 35, men and women who had already demonstrated their great capabilities. One of the great similarities was that when you asked them a question, an important question, one that I would actually encourage you to think about yourself a bit, but a simple question. Tell me about a time in your life in which you learned something important about yourself as a leader. It's a question that, in effect, says, I don't want to hear about leadership in general. I want to hear about what you learned about yourself as a leader, an event or a relationship. And then to answer two questions. What did you learn? And second, how did you learn it? And interestingly enough, despite all the differences between the older and younger leaders, particularly the younger leaders talking about the importance of diversity and the importance of work-life balance and a whole host of other things, the thing that was similar across those leaders in business and government and military and religious organizations was the fact that everyone said that the most important times in which they learned something about leadership were not MBA programs, were not in college, were not informal leadership development programs, which is not to say that those things don't have value, because people often pointed to the value that they achieved from them. But if you really ask the question, when did I learn something important about being a leader? It could be something as sublime, as subtle as one young woman talking about making the transition from being a student of karate to be an instructor of karate. A moment in time taught her profound, important things for her about what it took to be an effective leader, to someone else talking about having to stand up and replace the platoon leader who had been killed in action, and the person had never wanted that role of responsibility, but knew that they had to take it on, and in that moment learned that they were capable of being a leader. So the fact is that the experiences that people pointed to range from everything very small to something extraordinarily large, but what was important is what it meant to them. So we call these crucible experiences in deference to a crucible, which you may be familiar with, whether you're a metallurgist or not. A crucible is a vessel within which things get formed, so often into which is poured molten steel or metal of various sorts. Alchemists would try and turn lead into gold. The crucible really is a very special moment in time, or a relationship during which some transformation occurs. From somebody I didn't know I could be to somebody I knew I could be, from something that I didn't realize I was capable of to something that I was remarkably capable of, and during which not only did something get revealed to me, but I also learned something very important about how I learn. So the first piece is, what's the lesson I learned about leadership? The other lesson I'll talk about in a moment is how I learn about learning, about how I learn. So crucibles, more often than not, people talked about as times of test. Sometimes it was remarkable success, sometimes it was incredible failure, but more often than not, it was a time in which somehow I got a glimpse of who I am and who I could be. And sometimes it was a quite positive one, sometimes it was quite chilling. Chilling in the sense that I saw that I was capable of things I never thought I was capable of, and I'm not particularly happy about it. Well, the insights that I began to get interested in as a result of that really had to do with what goes on in those critical times. Call it a defining moment, call it a crucible, call it a turning point in your life, call it a moment of adversity, but the real question is what goes on there? What is common amongst all the very different stories that people told? And I alluded to it a moment ago, but there really are two things. One is a lesson about leadership, and the other, and I'll argue much more importantly, is a lesson about how I learn. About how I learn important things. The lessons about leadership that people often refer to, frankly, were not particularly earth-shattering. They were the kind of thing that you could pick up any article or any book and you'd discover somebody talking about the importance of trust, or the importance of sometimes going with your gut, or the importance of actively listening to people as opposed to simply speaking all the time. And you look at the lesson that somebody referred to as having learning, you'd say, well, geez, why couldn't they have picked that up by reading an article or listening to a lecture or a TV program for that matter? But the fact was that suddenly it was their lesson. It wasn't something academic. It wasn't something apart. It was my own. It belonged to me. The second point that was important was that when I asked people, how did you learn that lesson? Quite often you would get a very valuable insight into how it is that people learn important things. Now the fact is we know from research that's been undertaken over the years that there are very different learning styles. Not everybody learns from reading a book, not everybody learns from a lecture, not everybody learns from trial by error. People are quite different in their learning styles. But what was interesting was the way in which these began to cohere as part of the story itself, which is sometimes I needed somebody else to point out to me that something important had happened. Sometimes I needed somebody else to provide me with a little bit of context. It's happened to me too, and this is not such a unique thing for you to experience. You can learn from other people's experiences as well. But the critical thing that I came to realize based on this research was that after doing initially 70 interviews and then close to 150 interviews with leaders who were nominated by an advisory council made up of university presidents and business school deans, that leaders drawn from business, from government, from the private sector, public sector, from a variety of other places, including leaders I'll talk about in a moment who reside in the professional fields of entertainment and sports, demonstrate some very interesting similarities when it comes to the way they use experience to learn.